One of the things that we talked about just before was around the feeling that some organizations have there's a bit more flexibility to it, but I think that's just a change in the way that you can assess it based on more of taking a risk-based approach.
So this is one of the real step changes. As I mentioned, I probably think it's the biggest change structurally to PCI DSS from version 3 to version 4, is this concept of more flexibility. And what the Security Standards Council brought out in the various drafts before this was officially, kind of released as the official version of the standard, was something called the customized approach. And what the customized approach is, if we pedal back a little bit to when we started this session, we talked about PCI DSS being very prescriptive. And I like that, as I said, I like a standard that's quite prescriptive. I don't like things being hand wavy because it becomes very subjective then for the assessor to decide what is acceptable or not. And I think what happened is, if we go back in time a bit, my feeling is that, a lot of people got up on the bandwagon and denounced PCI DSS because it was so inflexible, because it was so prescriptive. Now, the larger organizations and dare I say the very large banks, obviously have a big say in the direction that PCI DSS takes. And you need to consider that these big, large banks are often at the forefront of cybersecurity. They're protecting huge assets. They often have armies of cybersecurity consultants and employees, probably bigger than any of the QSAs I've ever set up. So these guys have got tons of time to focus on the bleeding edge of cybersecurity. And I fully appreciate, these guys were quite vocal in saying, we don't want to be prescriptive around the standard. We want the ability to do things our way because we take risks seriously. And I think they got their way. And that's what we saw in the release of the final version of 4.0, where this concept of a customized approach is completely accepted now. It's an acceptable way to meet a particular requirement, where you can adapt a requirement to your particular customized way of mitigating risk around that. Now, we've got to be very careful around this because this is you've got to unpack this very carefully. What this does say is that you do have more flexibility. What it doesn't say is it's going to be easier to become compliant to that particular control than the old way of doing it. And let me explain, because this is sometimes quite when you the devil is in the detail when you kind of step through this. So what the customized approach says is if we have a control that you feel you can meet through some other mechanism or some other way. You need to perform, you as the entity undergoing PCI DSS compliance, you need to go through a very thorough risk assessment process. And you have to build up a narrative which supports that you've done the due diligence, that you've followed a comprehensive risk assessment methodology, and you basically have to justify for that particular requirement why you believe your customized approach for deviating from the standard method is better or is at least as good. Now, not only do you have to do that as the entity undergoing compliance, now you have to convince the assessor to the same level. Now, let's think about this. Let's put this all on the table. An assessor comes in and says, all right, you say you don't have to implement firewalls. And I'm choosing a stupid example. We don't have to do firewalls because we use zero trust or something like that. Now, the entity has to now prove that they believe through a thorough risk assessment process why they feel that control meets that particular requirement. Now you have to take that piece of work and the assessor has to go through a huge work activity to convince himself that that is acceptable. So you have to now convince the assessor. Now think about this. The assessor has done probably hundreds of other assessments using the standard methodology. He knows in and out what a good firewall is, what it looks like when it's configured correctly, when it's being used effectively. Now you've got to convince the assessor on a completely new tangential, maybe it's left field, maybe it's a new cutting, bleeding stage technology that's just come out. You've got to convince him to that. So all of this takes extra time. So if you're prepared to invest the time and the effort to go down a customized approach as an entity undergoing compliance, and if you're prepared, because I have no doubt that the assessor is going to charge you extra because it'll take him extra time and effort to go through your validation process. If you're willing to invest on all that, absolutely, the standard can be more flexible, but it doesn't mean it's going to be easier. And I think an entity needs to be really cautious, unless you have a real, dare I say, if you're a masochist and you enjoy debating the finer points of technology solutions and the effective mitigation, not only internally, but then with your assessor, who quite frankly probably wants to get the job done and move on to his next client. If you're a masochist and you enjoy that kind of pain, go for it. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I mean, some entities this will really work for. Maybe they work entirely in a cloud environment and they're doing things differently. Absolutely, this may be for them. But for the regular man on the street undergoing PCI compliance, I'm a little bit skeptical whether this is a practical route to go.
Naturally, I guess a few people are thinking, "Oh, great, this is get out of jail for a free card. I can't patch this system. This is years old. Oh, don't worry, I'll just take a risk-based approach on this then." And
what I do want to stress about what I just said before and what you summed up now is there may well be scenarios. Remember, the standard doesn't get updated every day, doesn't get updated every week. It takes years for them to get even an interim update out. So if a new innovative technology comes out that really is pretty obvious, is way better than any requirement that's within PCI DSS, and your assessor, and I go back to that relationship I said you have with your assessor, that they mustn't be treated as an auditor. If you have a good relationship with your assessor, they should be cybersecurity savvy. And if this new technology is way better than anything else out there, and that's pretty acceptable that that's the way forward, this is a great way to leverage off the customized approach, because you may then be able to leverage off that and fast track some aspects of your compliance. But it goes down to that relationship.